Thanks everyone. So today my talk's going to be on exploiting secrets and exactly kind of how we can do that. Kind of attack-focused talk. There's been a lot of really technical talks today, which have been and yesterday, which have been fantastic. I'm much lazier, so I'm always keen just to find credentials and use them. So this is the lazy man's guide to how to attack things today. But very quickly, I have just 2 slides just to make sure everyone's up to speed. What it is that I'm talking about when I'm talking about secrets. So digital authentication credentials, and typically these are your API keys, your credential peers, security certificates, just anything you don't want someone else to have. Everything that authenticates you is covered under this kind of category of secrets. And the reason why these are so problematic and so predominant is we've gone through a huge shift in building applications. We're no longer building these standalone monoliths anymore, particularly in web applications. We're building systems that consist of multiple different building blocks, and a lot of those building blocks are third-party tools. So the obvious ones are like credit card processing, right? You're mad if you're going to try and build that yourself. It's much easier just to use Stripe. You can use a managed database. You can take out-of-the-box authentication with Okta, who's a sponsor here. So our application ends up, a collection of these different building blocks. But it's not just for our application now, it's also for our infrastructure, how we host our application, how we test our application. All of these services now rely on secrets to be able to authenticate ourselves. Once we have our application running, we gain more vulnerabilities with the marketing teams, the sales teams, then they want integrations into different areas. And then, of course, we have all our own microservices that we build ourselves that rely on different authentication methods. So let's just quickly kind of get everyone up to speed. Every single one of these logos is a potential access point. If I can get into one, then my goal will be to try and elevate my privileges, find additional credentials, move laterally into different areas. So this can be an initial access point. It can be a point of privilege escalation, or it can just be a point of actually be able to do something malicious immediately in the case of cloud provider keys or anything similar. All right, so I want to start off. I'm going to look at finding these credentials in lots of different places. One of the first places I want to talk about is on GitHub. So we're all familiar with GitHub. They boast about 83 million developers use GitHub. It's huge amounts of volume. It's a literal fire hose of data, and so much stuff ends up on GitHub. So I have a very quick experiment that I want to do that I'll come back to. So I have here just a random GitHub commit, and I have here an AWS credential. This is a canary token, so that just means that if someone tries to exploit this, then they will let me know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the number one thing that no one should do. I'm going to commit this into my public repository. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to be able to monitor who's going to try and exploit this. So we'll come back in a few minutes and we'll see if anyone in the time that I've talking has tried to exploit this credential. But first, some research that we've done. So I work for Git Guardian. So we're a company that specializes in finding secrets. But every year we write reports and publishings about where we've found credentials. So we scanned every single commit that was made to GitHub in 2021. So if you push something publicly to GitHub, we scanned it for secrets. I'll explain exactly how we do that. But we found over 6 million. So it was about a 2 times increase from 2020, but there were some other factors in that, like the number of developers increasing and the amount of secrets we're trying to find increasing. But it's just a huge volume. The types of secrets that we find, we're able to validate most of them. So it's not like we're categorizing random high entropy strings that may be a unique identifier as a secret. So 21% were for databases, 15% were for cloud storage. So you don't need to be a genius to know what to do with a cloud storage key if it gets leaked. And all the way down, even version control systems. So we're finding GitHub tokens to private repositories in public repositories. So very clear escalation where you can go from there. So the problem is really, really massive. This is just kind of funny. We found 500 commit messages that contained the GitHub token. So this is like if you put your the password for your email address in the subject line and send an email. This is basically the equivalent on Git, is when you're putting your credentials to access private repositories in your Git message. But we find 500 of these, which I was really surprised at. And we can also kind of do some cool analysis on a high level of when we're actually be able to see up-and-coming players becoming more prominent. And we can do that by the number of secrets that we find. So PlanetScale and Superbase are two new kind of cloud providers. And then we've seen dramatic increases in the amount of secrets that we find of those leaked. And that's important because I just leaked an AWS key. You'll find that lots of people are looking for AWS keys, including AWS themselves. So they're trying to alert their users if one is found and leaked. But as we're growing these number of services, there's so many opportunities for an attacker to go down different paths, finding different credentials that don't have that maturity, that don't have the same volume of people trying to prevent this from it. Okay, so let's just have a quick look. It's probably a little bit too soon, but let's have a... So this is how many people have tried to exploit this. Now, granted, a lot of these IP addresses are going to be the same. This isn't a new person, but we can see in here where they're coming from. This one's actually from Amazon, but if we've got a lot from Berlin, coming from down there. And so we can actually see what they're trying to do looking at them. So these are the number of times that they've tried to exploit that at the moment. So a lot of people are monitoring public GitHub repositories for these secrets. So how do we do this? If you're an attacker, how do you actually find credentials that are useful and how do you go about that? So it's actually quite easy, and I'll run through some ways of how we can use GitHub to be able to do that. The first one is not my favorite way, but it's the most accessible, so I'll talk about it. And that's GitHub dorking. And it's basically using the GitHub search feature to be able to find credentials. So here we're looking for a file called credentials, and we're looking for an AWS access key inside that file. There's a huge list of these kind of searches that you can do. I don't find these particularly useful. The reason why is that a lot of the secrets that you'll find are kind of buried in history, and the search feature only looks at the top layer. So if you really want to have some meaningful results, then you want to go a lot deeper than that. But fortunately for the bad guys, there's a much better way of monitoring GitHub for these credentials. That's using and abusing the GitHub API. So when you release something publicly, it's not just accessible, it's actually broadcast. So anyone can go to this address. You don't even need authentication. If you go to apis.github.com/events, you'll get a list of all public activity. And there's a bunch of different events that we can look for, but the main ones are the public event. This is by far the most interesting because this is when a private repository goes public and bringing with it all of its history. So if someone committed something in a development branch a year ago, it accidentally got merged to master or whatever's happened, even if it's clean now, there's going to be traces of that in the history. And when it goes public, it brings with it everything. And the push event is just when we push code. So literally anyone can... Yeah. So literally anyone can see this. Just trying to clean it up. And you can see in here, we get a lot of information too. So it's not just kind of the information that's happened. We also get the email address of the user and their GitHub ID, which is important when we go back to trying to refine. One of the difficulties with GitHub, especially, is the amount of information. It's kind of like almost a level of security of how much stuff is out there. So it makes it difficult to be able to extract meaningful and be able to extract the meaningful data or sensitive data from just the fire hose that is there. But we can use the information about users when they commit to be able to distinguish this. So for example, if I'm wanting to target a specific victim, so I'm wanting to target a company, Uber, Twilio, Monday.com, anyone specifically, there's so much information coming out there, and there's a tiny, tiny percentage that I want. So, and I don't want to be wasting computational power scanning everything. So what do? So the main step that I want from the GitHub API is to try and identify GitHub IDs of all of their employees. So how do we do that? We basically look for the victim domain in the commit. So in the commit metadata, if they're using at Uber email address, then I know that they're going to be an employee of Uber, and I can monitor that GitHub ID. And then it doesn't matter if they commit with their personal email or professional email, I've marked them as someone that's interesting. We can do the same with GitHub bios. We can exfiltrate and scrape that information and try and create a list. Or any kind of mention of the company in the code is another way to refine that. Once we compile a list of IDs, then we can use lots of different tools. GG Shield is one. I work for GitGuardian. We build that, so I'm totally biased. But if you don't trust me, there's heaps of other ones. Trufflehog, Git Secret. And then basically, you just go into enumerate through your list of GitHub IDs, scan the entire history, and you're going to be able to find interesting stuff because employees very regularly, and we know from breaches that have happened, accidentally will commit sensitive information on their personal accounts. So this is one way to kind of narrow down what we're looking for in this fire hose of information. Another way, the spray and pray way, which is very common, is, and it's what we've seen a lot of those bots that were just trying to access that token of mine were doing, and they're listening for specific API keys, so they may have some greps for AWS keys, Slack keys, anything that's interesting. They're going to find all of these, and then they're going to sell them. Anyone that spent any amount of time on the dark web or in some dodgy Telegram channels, lovely places, but anyone that's done that will know that there's credentials everywhere for sale. So a lot of common ones are like Slack credentials, because a lot of employees will work on a Slack bot as a personal project, but accidentally commit that, and then you have a way into that company. Package managers, we see a lot of them being sold. GitHub tokens, we've just seen that there are lots of GitHub tokens themselves. So if you have a private GitHub token that gives access to a company internal repository, that's really interesting. So if you're not looking for a specific victim and you just want to sell credentials on the dark web, then this is an absolutely widely used path to be able to gather them and then sell them for someone else. So lots and lots of different areas. You're probably not going to use open source tools for the scanning because they scan for huge different types of secrets. It's going to take a lot, especially if you're scanning all of GitHub. So you're probably just looking for specific, have some grep queries for some specific keys that are prefixed. So like Slack tokens always start with the same characters, same character length. So they're easier to find with less trouble. So we have heaps of bad actors that are monitoring GitHub for this. Another area that is plentiful for sensitive information is areas like Docker Hub or other package managers. So on Docker, there's around about 8 million, or I think it's closer to 9 million Docker images hosted on there that are publicly available. So huge volumes. It's really where everyone is kind of storing their information. So we did some widespread scanning on Docker to see how many of these actually contain secrets. And we found that nearly 5% contained at least one plain text credential inside it. So that's absolutely huge. You download 100 Docker images, you're going to have 5 credentials, and some of them will be really interesting. They're different to the types of credentials that we find on GitHub, for example. We find a lot more package managed credentials and other areas, but they're really, really interesting. So how do we go about for discovering this? So we need to look a little bit about how Docker works to know how secrets actually end up in Docker. So many times technology like Docker is viewed as this mysterious black box that once code goes into this black box, it's unreadable, it's unusable, it's just kind of mystery. But that's not actually true because it's just code. It may be obfuscated, but it's just code. And like Git, Docker also maintains some form of history. So there's this cool free tool called Dive that you can use. It's an open source project. And basically what this is showing is up the top there, we have the Docker file, and we're going through in layers. So what we can see here is what's in green is the files that have been added. This is just code. If there's secrets in that code, it's gonna be in the Docker file. And there's some interesting ways that these actually end up in there. This is one that confuses me, but I really see it a lot, is when you kind of add a repository, a package manager password, credentials to access a package manager into your Docker file and then remove it later, thinking that in the final Docker image, the credential won't be there. But Docker's built up on layers. So just as I showed going through those layers of when files were added, if you add credentials in a Docker image and remove them later, they're still going to be extractable. So we find lots of secrets like this. Doing this as a bad guy is actually quite simple. It's a little bit more straightforward because you're just looking for the Docker files of companies. And I'll show some exploits, some breaches that have actually happened because of this. The last area before I kind of go into go into the anatomy of some breaches that have happened is private repositories. Private repositories hide behind this word private, but source code is incredibly leaky and it doesn't have adequate protections, and nor should it, to have sensitive information. So you think about who you want to have access to your credentials, and there's a very small list of people. You know, it's your project leads, it's the managers that have access to everything, and then should be very restricted. But if you think about who in your company has access to your private repositories, then it's widely open. If secrets end up in your private repositories, everyone has access to them. And private repositories are really bad at staying private. So we scanned a bunch of large companies' private repositories that use our service. So we find on average, so if on the average company with 400 developers, we'll find about 13,000 secrets. 1,000 of those are unique. So that's a huge amount of unique secrets that we'll find in a private code repository. And there's ways that we can abuse this too. So we obviously need access somehow to that private repository. Either it's accidentally been misconfigured and we have public access, or we've compromised a developer, a user. So this is kind of coming back to, where we see a lot of these credentials being sold on dark web. A very popular one is access to internal private repositories, and I'll show you some other ways that you can gain access to them. But then what you can do is, if you get access and you've found that the code is segmented and that you don't have access to everything, there's free tools that will abuse the internal APIs of popular VCSs like Bitbucket, GitLab, to try and elevate their privileges. So one example is a free tool by IBM X-Force called SCM Kit, Source Code Management Kit. And it's basically going to run through a list of different scenarios where it's going to try and create duplicate accounts. It's going to try and find sensitive information. It's going to try and find misconfigurations that it can exploit, all using that internal API, which will enable users to elevate their privileges. You can also do things like try and abuse the pipelines, inject malicious packages. One example is someone was bragging how all their secrets are totally segmented, and they only have developer secrets for developers, and it's great. But actually, all you needed to do is change in the configuration file of the CI/CD pipeline, dev to prod under secrets, and then you could just dump out all the environment variables for the production secrets. So there's lots of different ways that you can try and abuse this. And then, of course, once you have access to that, we scan the history again, and we can guarantee to find some really interesting information. So this is just a common workflow. And of course, there's others out there of how you can abuse internal repositories, even if there is some additional layers of security in there. Now, the other thing I said, private source repositories are really bad at staying private. So Cyber News recently did some wide-scale kind of domain scanning to try and identify if there's any .git directories exposed. So they found over 2 million accidentally public .git directories. So a .git directory isn't a Git repository, but it does contain all of the metadata for your repository. So your history is in there, and you can reconstruct it. So about 2% of all the web servers that they scanned had exposed .git directories. So again, you don't need to look very far to try and find something that has some interesting information in it. And although they didn't do the next step and actually scan these for secrets, they did find lots of interesting information in there, including credentials in the configuration files, which is the only thing that they really scanned. So we know that this is going to be a huge problem and another weak point. So we really can't rely on private repositories staying private. So what's the workflow for this? Well, it's quite simple. You have a victim domain. Use free tools out there to try and find as many subdomains and areas as possible. Chaos is one, Subfinder, and basically give you the biggest list for your victim possible. Then try and find the assets. So there's some free tools as well, a mass DIR search. And then once you've kind of found your Git repositories or your Git directories or anything else of interest, you can reconstruct them. Again, free tools, Git Hacker will reconstruct a Git directory. Once you have that Git directory, you can scan the history and find secrets and move forward. So again, like a very easy workflow of being able to find sensitive information inside Git directories that have been accidentally exposed. So we really cannot rely that our private code is going to stay private. There's lots of ways that this does happen. It usually comes through manual deployments. So if you are just stupid example, if you're hosting a static website, perhaps using an Amazon S3 bucket, and you copy across everything, including the Git directory, then that's going to be publicly available. But lots of other ways too. So let's have a look at some attacks that have actually happened that use these techniques to be able to gain access. So Codecov, you probably heard about the Codecov breach that happened. It happened last year. So Codecov, for those that don't know, is a code coverage tool. It basically tests how much of your application is being tested, and it sits in the CI/CD pipeline. So it does a very specific job. Personally, I think Codecov's a great tool, and it's still out there. It's still really cool, but they did make a mistake that caused a lot of havoc. At the time of the breach, they had 23,000 customers. They have a lot more now. So what exactly happened? In their official Docker image, there was a plain text credential that someone found. So anyone could have downloaded this. Anyone could have exploited this. That credential gave access to a file, a bash uploader script. I believe it was a Google storage credential. So that bash uploader script was used by a lot of Codecov's customers, and they were able to inject malicious code into this bash uploader script. Then basically what happened is that script did something very simple. Essentially, it said every time someone runs Codecov, take all the environment variables and send them to the attacker. So this affected lots of people that were using it. Rapid7, Twilio, Monday.com, HashiCorp were all affected by this. So it was only one line of code that was in there. You can see that there. It's on line 525 of, I think, nearly 2,000. So this was a really kind of ugly file, not very excited. Would have been pretty easy to miss this. And what this code is saying is just to basically take the environment variables and send them to this IP address. Now, hopefully, you're using development credentials to test your application. If that's the case, then the development credentials and secrets would have been sent to the attacker. But the attacker was after something different. They wanted the credentials for private repositories, because then they were able to move into the private repositories of those companies I just mentioned. HashiCorp, Twilio, Monday.com. I'm a bit mean to HashiCorp now, specifically, because after this breach, HashiCorp had to put out a public statement because they had private keys that were exposed because someone gave access to their repositories. Now, HashiCorp, another great company, builds a fantastic tool to manage your secrets, HashiCorp Vault. It's one of the best tools out there. If HashiCorp, who invented the term secrets rule, who build secrets protectors, have secrets in plain text in their repositories, there's no hope for anyone. So they had secrets exposed because of this, and so did lots of others. So it's a really, really widespread problem. So what about an attack from initial access? So there's a few to choose from. Uber had one where employees uploaded S3 bucket credentials into their personal accounts. I'll use this one, SolarWinds. So we all know about the supply chain attack of SolarWinds. I like to preface this by saying this was a very sophisticated attack with multiple different elements. There was a chain of events that created what it did. This is one of those chains, but it's not everything about this attack. So what do we know? So in September in 2019, we know that threat actors gained initial access to SolarWinds FTP update server. So, and this was what they had access to because they were able to inject a malicious package into this FTP update server. So it wasn't discovered till much later on, but around about 2019 in September was the initial access. Now, coincidentally, in 2019 in September, a SolarWinds employee committed code that contained credentials to that FTP server in their public personal repository. A security researcher actually found this and notified SolarWinds, but I imagine that the threat actors had already elevated their privileges enough or maintained secondary access through various means that it wouldn't have mattered had these been revoked at that point. So this is an example of an employee committing secrets to their personal account. And I keep saying personal because it's really interesting because your personal GitHub repositories are not in the security scope of your organization. My employee can't limit what I do on my personal activity. So that's good, but it's also bad because I can do really silly things by myself. So this is an example of that happening and threat actors using probably some of the techniques of the GitHub API, being able to discover this. They noted that this was an employee of SolarWinds, and we all know the rest. The last one I'll talk about is, I lied, I think I've got two more. But this one is talking about private source code. So this year we've had hundreds of source code leaks. And they're all kind of prefaced with, it's not that big a deal. We don't rely on our source code being private for security. But we'll find out that that's actually a lie. Most companies do, even if they don't even know it. But we've had huge amounts of breaches, including Lapsus earlier this year that came to prominence. And they leaked the source code of Microsoft, Nvidia, Samsung, all these major companies. And we found out that these was just a group of teenagers. So how did a group of teenagers manage to gain access to that? I'll talk about that in a minute. But I also want to talk about Twitch, because Twitch's source code was leaked, and in the headlines we all found out what Twitch streamers earned, which was a lot of money. But that was kind of like the main focus on it. But we downloaded a copy of Twitch's code that was leaked. So 6,000 repositories were leaked. There was 3,000 documents. So it was about 200 gigabytes of data. And we found nearly 6,000, or actually well over 6,000 credentials in here, including 194 AWS keys, 69 Twilio keys, 68 Google keys, 14 GitHub access tokens, and 4 Stripe keys, amongst others. So lots of really interesting secrets in here. Now, this all stemmed from a misconfiguration error, and the attacker actually published the code on the internet, which was the best thing that they could have done for Twitch, because Twitch knew that they had a problem. Had they had much more malicious intent, then they could have taken these credentials, and even if they didn't want to exploit them, they could have sold them on the dark web, on dodgy Telegram channels, for other people to launch an attack, and Twitch may not have even known that they had a problem. So another example of private code being really bad at staying private. The last one, I talked about Samsung, Nvidia, Microsoft, these were all from the Lapsus group. So there were some pretty bad ones because there was signing keys from Nvidia that were used to sign malware. These keys had actually expired, but just how it works with low-level credentials is that they often still are accepted and trusted in different areas. So this was a really bad one. These were in Nvidia's source code, these keys. So how does a group of teenagers gain access to such great companies' source code that really take it seriously? They pay people for them. So here is Lapsus's Telegram channel, and they're basically saying that we recruit employees at any of the following, and we just want access to your internal networks, or your internal Git repositories, or whatever, and we pay you a lot of money. So now we think about, if all these secrets are in our source code repository, do we really trust all of our employees completely? I mean, we should, but we should theoretically trust them, but we shouldn't in practice. Because there's so much sensitive information that we can find, even if it's not a critical asset. So you, as an intern that just got a speeding fine, may take $5,000 to giving access to an internal repository and not even feel that bad about it, thinking that there's not much in there. But this is actually what these attacking groups are really after. So this is an example, but of course, these credentials can be purchased in different areas as well. So there's lots of different ways of how we can do it. So private source code being really bad at being private. The last one I'll talk about here is this one that was recently happened, and that is Uber. So this one was actually an example of a credential being purchased on the dark web. So this was for a VPN that was purchased. They did have multi-factor authentication, but they, doing some social engineering, were able to get the victim to actually accept their multi-factor attempts. They gained access to the VPN, and then they started scanning Uber's infrastructure, and then they found something really interesting. It was like a worst-case scenario for Uber. They found admin credentials to their PAM system, Privileged Access Management, on a PowerShell script that was version controlled. So a PAM system is like your secrets manager and your password manager rolled into one. So once they had admin credentials, they were able to create user accounts for literally all of Uber's internal infrastructure, their AWS accounts. They could turn off their extended threats detection. They could do so many different things. Now, again, this was linked to the Lapsus group. And again, there wasn't really that much malicious intent. It's more clout that they seem to be after, because then they started spamming the Slack channels and letting everyone know at Uber that they had been breached. But you could have been much more malicious. You literally could have shut down Uber for a day with the credentials that they had access to. And this was in a PowerShell script that was version controlled, but also just on their network. So lots and lots and lots of different scenarios where we can use the techniques that were discussed to really find these credentials and exploit them. Okay, so coming to the end, why does this happen? Why do secrets, right? This problem shouldn't exist. Everyone here would know not to put credentials in their Git repositories, hopefully. So why do we do it? And it just happens with human error, and it happens all the time. GitHub is like really unique because people often have a personal account, a professional account, but it uses the same authentication. So we can accidentally push to the wrong repository really easily. We forget that stuff is buried in our history. If you look at kind of the Git code review process, if you're working on a development branch, you quickly code an API key to get something working. You delete it. A couple of commits later, you goes to code review and you do a merge request. The code review is just looking at the latest version of the code. They're not going to go through the entire history. Well, at least I'm not. But we all established that I'm lazy at the start. So the credentials won't be exposed there. It's in their history, and then no one knows about it. Then that repository actually gets made public later on. Credentials are there. Secrets exposed in logs and auto-generated files. This is a big one. So if you do a debug log, it's often going to have credentials inside it. If you're not careful about what you're adding into your Git repositories and you add everything, then they're going to end up in there. So in lots of different other sensitive files. And we're also just seeing secrets being managed in Git a lot. It seems weird. It's bad practice, but it's not going to stop. And that's because it's easy. Lots of people need access to secrets. It's difficult to segment them. It's difficult to implement good secrets management. So it's just easier to not worry about it, which often comes case. So how do we harden our repositories? Honestly, none of this is rocket science, especially the first three up there. Use a secrets manager. It's a crazy idea, but use one. And use the correct one. Just because HashiCorp Vault may have the most amount of features, and it is a fantastic tool, perhaps it's too heavy for your use in a smaller company. Perhaps there's other tools that may be better. The important thing is that people actually use the tools that you put in place. And if you don't have good documentation or training on how to use them, it's not going to work very well. Never put secrets anywhere near your code. Use short-lived credentials, so don't make things live forever. So these three are pretty obvious. Restrict your API access. Again, obvious one. Just because someone has an API key doesn't mean you have to give them access to your service. We can put additional layers of security in here. Adversaries are using automated secrets detection. Add secrets detection. Plenty of open source tools that we discussed that can do this for free. There's vendors like I work for that can do it as well. And the last one there, I used the canary token at the start of this presentation to illustrate people attacking credentials in public code repositories. You can use these internally too. They're great. They're free. You can recreate that experiment I did really easily in free canary tokens. It doesn't need to be big, but place these around so you actually get alerted when someone is inside your infrastructure. So that's it. Here is a QR code. If you're interested in finding out more, that gives me a backdoor into your phone. I mean, that is for a report. So all the research is in they call a report called the State of Secrets Sprawl that you can find at that URL or just by searching for it, or you can scan the QR code if you're game. Promise I won't do anything bad. And yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions in a minute if you have any. Thanks.
Any questions?
Hi. So what about using the secrets section of the GitHub repositories?
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of different tools and areas out there, and if you're using like GitHub Actions, then storing secrets in there, absolutely. The problem is not that we lack tools to be able to securely do it. The problem is just that as humans, we make mistakes, and at a large scale, those mistakes are easily found and exploited. So we definitely should be using the tools for that. We definitely should be using secrets managers. We definitely should be using the correct processes around that. But it's not always going to happen. And with things currently the way they are, I can reliably say that secrets will absolutely still be leaked. Not because the correct path isn't there, but because we choose not to use it or we fail to use it.
Yeah, so you was like talking about like analyzing every like events with the API key of GitHub. Yeah. Did you try like Google BigQuery, to analyze like GitHub datasets? And like if yes, do you get like good results with it?
Yeah. So one of the cool things at GitGuardian is when we actually have a complete copy of GitHub for like the last 4 years. So if you've done something on, and we're not the only ones that have this too. It's publicly available. There's plenty of people to do it. So if you've committed something and then you've realized that you've committed a key and you quickly delete it, it still exists out there. It's going to still exist on GitHub because it takes months before it's truly deleted from the areas. It's not visible anymore, but it still exists. And it's going to be in different areas, including our data set. So we've been doing lots of cool things with that data set. We created a tool called Has My Code Leaked? hasmycodeleaked.com. And basically what that does is locally it fingerprints your code it sends us all the fingerprints of every version of your code based on your Git history. And then we will match that in our database to see if any private code has actually been made its way publicly, and any version of that. So not just, has your entire repository been made, but has anything from your fingerprints been exposed publicly. And there's lots of other interesting things that we can do with that data set, and that other people can do, and explore that in different ways. But those data sets do exist, and we can query it. And for lots of different things too, not just secrets. If you've got internal systems that are sensitive, we can find if they've ever made it public, different areas. So yeah, we can, but there's a lot more that we can do. If you have ideas, let me know. I'm happy to play.
You mentioned at the beginning that you validated the credentials, right?
Yeah.
Did you run into any issue, like legal issues because of that? Because I assume this might not be viewed so nicely by companies.
Yeah, so we can't validate all credentials for these reasons. But we fall, there is a gray line there for some of them. We fall within the terms of services for a lot because we're not using malicious intent behind them, and we're using the lowest possible, for example, AWS keys, we're using the lowest API event that we can to try and determine if it's real. And then we also validate, and then we also have services that allow us to do this. And then you can also find our IP address that we use to ping them, so that you can, if you've had a breach and you want to know if a service is access and our IP address comes up, you can check that it hasn't been us. But the reason why we absolutely do this, and we have a free service, so if you leak something and we find it, we will email you to let you know, especially if it's highly sensitive. And we do this because we find it to be irresponsible if we didn't. If we were scanning the whole set, okay, there is some gray lines here, but we feel it would be irresponsible if we didn't let you know that you've leaked a key, and we know that you have. So, that's kind of, our justification for it. But we don't fall outside the terms and services of the ones that we check generally, or ever, I should say. But sometimes that's because they're poorly written.
Question: when it comes to guardrails here, you can also mention gitignore files. It's a good way to prevent committing secrets.
So, absolutely, yeah, you're right. I definitely should have. I should have mentioned that. Every repository should have a gitignore file as an absolute minimum, just to exclude those auto-generated files. Good point. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So thank you very much. Please give her another round of applause for Mackenzie.